This video is sponsored by me. My newest novel, A Succubus's Tale, has just been released. If you're interested in a little dark fantasy, do take a look. So, it's finally happened. I never thought it would. I woke up last Thursday, had breakfast in my kitchen, started driving to work. On the way, I listened to breaking news on the radio about the fact that Russia has actually invaded Ukraine again. The reasons for the invasion have been rampant all over the media, and the channel Real Life Lore made a very good video which details about the reasons why Russia has invaded Ukraine. Based on what Putin claims, he wants the West to remove all troops stationed in the eastern states, freeze the NATO alliance as is, meaning make sure it gets new members. Something that has been highlighted when Finland was threatened about any thoughts about joining the alliance. But for attacking Ukraine, the Russians claim that they want the country to be either a buffer zone or a neutral state in order to keep NATO borders away. This is what Real Life Lore did a very good job of tackling.
From Moscow's perspective, these states provided a massive buffer against any potential military incursion from their primary Cold War rivals to the west in NATO. You see, from the Netherlands in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, this whole part of Europe is dominated by a geographic feature called the North European Plain. Almost entirely flat, the plain is shaped like a funnel, with a very narrow width in northern Germany, but with a mouth that opens up increasingly wider as it approaches the Ural Mountains. As the open plain gets wider across the east, it becomes increasingly difficult to defend across its entire length. And as a result, from the perspective of any regime based in Moscow, regardless of the time period and regardless of the ideology, it is imperative to expand control westwards across as much of this open plain as possible in order to narrow the gap that they need to defend in the event of a conflict with the West. During the Cold War, the control of this plain by a regime in Moscow was at its greatest historical extent, and was exerted either outright or by proxy from the Urals all the way through East Germany. And the entire wider section of the funnel was firmly controlled by Moscow, with Austria and Finland remaining neutral and Yugoslavia a non-aligned communist state. The only fronts that Moscow at the time had to truly worry about against NATO were across the Sudeten Mountains, the Black Sea, and a narrow line across the North European plain in central Germany, all easily defensible positions. Any invasion of the Soviet world from the west across these geographic frontiers would have been incredibly difficult. But in the 30 years since 1991, the situation has changed dramatically against Moscow's favor. Today, the former Warsaw Pact territories of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria are all a part of NATO, while the former Soviet republics themselves of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all are as well. This reality has pushed the NATO front lines significantly further to the east, across the wider section of the North European plain, and has separated Russian territory between the mainland and the Kaliningrad exclave here, across what's known as the Suwalki Gap. If you're sitting in the Kremlin in Moscow and you still believe that NATO is a hostile military alliance, or could become one in the future, then this situation understandably looks pretty grim. But it's not totally lost yet. In the years following the breakup of the Soviet Union, many of the newly independent republics established and joined their own military alliance called the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, which in Europe consists of Russia, Belarus, and Armenia, but not Ukraine, which has remained a sort of neutral zone between NATO in the west and the CSTO in the east. And now, within this lens, you can easily see why Ukraine is currently and always will be a geographic core interest to Moscow. If Ukraine is within Moscow's orbit, then it pushes the CSTO's and Moscow's defensive lines to the Carpathian Mountains in the southwest, and it narrows their exposure across the North European plain to only the eastern border of Poland. And while the Baltic states do lie across the plain as well, CSTO forces could easily encircle them by rapidly advancing across the narrow Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, and cut them off from the rest of NATO, meaning that they aren't as grave of of a geographical threat. Conversely, however, if Ukraine became a NATO member state, it would surge the NATO front lines far beyond the Carpathian Mountains and far across the wider section of the North European plain, and place the new defensible front line across nearly 2,300 kilometers of open, hard-to-defend, flat land, the easternmost section of which would only be a little more than 300 kilometers away from Volgograd, which, if taken, would shut down the entire Volga River and cut off Russia's valuable oil and gas resources coming up from around the Caspian Sea from the rest of the country, as nearly happened during the Second World War, back when the city was better known as Stalingrad. Even further, Belarus, a friendly and loyal CSTO state that is often considered a mere extension of Moscow itself, would suddenly become an indefensible salient protruding deep into the NATO front lines, surrounded entirely by NATO territory on 3 flanks. Thus, Ukraine's outright control by Moscow, or at least neutrality, is essential to the defense of the CSTO and Russia.
It is with this that Putin claims that the West is surrounding Russia. Well, this video is meant to call out some hypocrisy, as Russia is doing something similar to the US with its own military bases. Let's start in the Northwest. It is easy to see Russia and the US as half a world away, but what you have to remember is that these two countries are next-door neighbors through the Bering Strait. Russia's far eastern Chukotka region has seen a rise in military activity. The Russian military has set up bases in Anadyr and Cape Schmidt. They are a part of the Eastern Military District and have a strength of approximately 160,000 troops in the form of all 3 branches.
The head of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, warning a new generation of Russian cruise missiles could strike critical military radars and missiles inside the United States.
The development of the cruise missiles that they have that have a very long range, that from eastern Russia, they can range critical infrastructure in Alaska and in Canada that we rely on for a homeland defense mission.
In an attempt to destroy.
By comparison, Alaska's main defense falls under the responsibility of the Alaskan National Guard, which only has around 20,000 troops. It only has 2 Air Force bases at Eielson and Elmendorf, and 1 naval base at Anchorage. Given the proximity to Russia, which is only 53 kilometers at its narrowest point through the Bering Strait, and the few troops stationed there, Alaska is quite vulnerable to a Russian attack, including that from ground forces. That is just the northwestern region, so to say. Another sector is to the north of the US and Canada. Russia also has military bases in the Arctic, the most notable of which is Nagorskoye Air Base, over 1,340 kilometers north of Murmansk. This base, along with others in the surrounding area, was built with the goal of housing long-range bombers that could reach the US. The Arctic has been a vital area since the Cold War because the fastest way to get bombers to the US is through the Arctic itself. That is the reason why the US and Canada created a layered air defense in the 1950s, and it is why the Trump administration actually wanted to buy Greenland from Denmark. The simple fact is that North America does border Russia to the north, and that frontier is open to Russian airstrikes. It's been like that for decades. Now, that's just the North. During the Cold War, both the US and Soviet Union took a keen interest in Latin America to the south of the US. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a clear example. Well, now that is kind of a reality. Ever since the mid-2000s, Moscow has established friendly relations with President Maduro in Venezuela, as well as interest in either establishing an air base or a naval base. In 2017, it turned out that they decided on building an air base in La Orchita, some 160 kilometers north of the capital, Caracas. Along with transport planes, Russia has also stationed Tu-160 Blackjack bombers on the facility. This is one of the heaviest attack aircraft in the world with a range of 12,300 kilometers. Venezuela is not the only nation that hosts them, as pro-communist President Daniel Ortega from Nicaragua allowed both Russian and Chinese bombers to set up a military presence in 2020. From these two countries, which are on the US's doorstep, Russian and apparently Chinese bombers would be able to strike the mainland US with both nuclear and conventional missiles. Modern-day missiles can fly over 1,000 kilometers, and given the range these bombers can fly, they would be capable of striking bombing the mainland US from both its east and west coasts as well as its southern states. These bombers can carry a considerable payload, and because of Russian bases being present at these locations, and with Russia even considering restationing its troops in Cuba, a country that is less than 200 kilometers from the US shoreline, you can see that Uncle Sam can be hit from all sides. Now, this is where the retort fanatics will say that this is impossible, as the US Navy will destroy all of them. Now look, given the payload these bombers can carry and the agility of these cruise missiles, it is illogical to believe that of the amount that will be launched, absolutely none of them will reach the US, and proof of this lies in a historical event. Starting on October 14, 1961, the US hosted two multinational exercises meant to test NORAD's defenses against Soviet bombers. They were both one of the largest air exercises in military history, involving over 6,000 sorties flown by aircraft from 3 nations. They were called Operation Sky Shields 1 and 2. Avro Vulcan bombers from the RAF played the role of Soviet bombers, who had the role of striking cities all over the US and Canada. A dozen of these Vulcans managed to penetrate air defenses and attack multiple cities and facilities across the continent. The results of these two exercises were so humiliating to the US that they didn't even declassify the details until 1997, almost 4 years after the exercises themselves. And what makes the situation even more dire is that the US also doesn't have as many coastal defenses as it once did. During the Cold War, when the biggest threat to the US were Soviet bombers, the US had multiple high-altitude interceptor missiles like the Nike Zeus to shoot them down. But from the late 1960s onwards, when ICBMs became the main threat, they were decommissioned. To this day, the US hasn't rebuilt these defenses to protect against cruise missiles. Covert Cabal did a very good job of tackling that problem in a video.
After World War II, the US built dozens of air defense sites to protect the US mainland. Nearly every major US city was guarded in all directions, creating a shield to defend them from attack. However, by the 1960s, ICBMs, and then finally the ABM Treaty in '72, saw the decommissioning and removal of them. The Cold War later ended, and there was no real need to defend the mainland.
But these bases will rarely be mentioned in Russian media, and in those times when they are glorified, while NATO expansion is condemned. So if Russia calls out US expansionism as provoking, then maybe its own bases in proximity to the US should be put into question as well by their own people. So know that Putin has no need to feel threatened. These bases mark the continuation, not the end, of a heightened stage of Moscow's involvement in Latin America and the Arctic. For the Kremlin, Venezuela's location and recent series of crises represent too good of a pretext to renounce, and has them claim the right to bases of their own. In the words of former White House Chief of Staff, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste.